Megan loved her birthday. Ever since she was a child, the day had always been a magical one: cake, laughter, and a room filled with friends and family. This year was no exception. Turning 25, she decided to throw a party at her parents' old house, a creaky Victorian that always added a hint of nostalgia. Her friends arrived on time, filling the dimly lit house with chatter and warmth. The dining room table groaned under the weight of snacks, drinks, and the piece de resistance, a towering chocolate cake adorned with a perfect spiral of 25 candles. "Make a wish, Megan," her best friend Claire called out as everyone gathered around the cake. Megan grinned, leaning forward to blow out the candles. But just as she exhaled, the room fell eerily silent. The lights flickered, and for a split second, the faces around her seemed to change, smiling mouths twisting into grimaces, eyes dark and hollow. The moment passed, and laughter erupted as the light steadied. Claire nudged her. "Spooky old house, huh?" Megan laughed it off, brushing away the unease that gnawed at the back of her mind. As the party wound down, Megan began cleaning up, her friends filtering out one by one. By midnight, the house was empty, save for Megan and the leftover cake. She wandered into the kitchen, turning on the light, and froze. Sitting on the counter was the cake, its candles relit. A chill ran down her spine. She had blown them out hours ago. Thinking it was some prank, she grabbed a dish towel and swatted the flames. They extinguished with a soft hiss, but as soon as she turned away, the room dimmed. The candles flickered back to life. This time, the flames burned taller, the wax melting at an unnaturally fast rate, pooling at the base of the cake. The temperature in the room dropped, her breath visible in the air. A soft whisper filled the kitchen, just behind her ear: "Make a wish." Megan spun around, heart racing. The room was empty, but the whispers continued, growing louder, overlapping into a cacophony. The candles burned brighter, their light casting shadows on the walls that moved on their own, creeping closer to her. Panicking, she grabbed the cake and threw it into the sink, turning on the faucet to douse the flames. But the water hissed and steamed, the fire refusing to die. Instead, the shadows stretched further, twisting into human-like forms that surrounded her. One stepped forward, its face an empty void, and reached out a hand made of smoke and ash. 25, it rasped. One for each year. One for each candle. Megan stumbled back, her mind racing. She thought of the wish she'd made earlier that evening: "I wish I could stay young forever." The figure loomed closer, its voice cold and hollow. "Youth has a cost." The shadows surged forward, their forms merging into one massive, writhing entity. Megan screamed as the darkness consumed her, her vision fading into nothingness. When she woke, the house was silent. The cake was gone. The candles were gone. Megan stood and looked at her reflection in the kitchen window. She gasped. Her face was pale, her eyes dull and sunken. Wrinkles crept across her skin like cracks in old porcelain. She tried to scream, but her voice was weak, raspy, ancient. In the empty silence, the whisper returned, soft and mocking. "Happy birthday, Megan." Eliza wasn't big on celebrating her birthday, but this year, her friends insisted. "You're turning 30, they said. It has to be special." Reluctantly, she agreed and hosted a small party in her new apartment. The building was old but charming, with creaky wooden floors and a draft that seemed to come from nowhere. The party started off perfectly. Her closest friends filled the living room, laughter bouncing off the walls as they sipped wine and shared embarrassing stories. The highlight of the evening was the vintage Polaroid camera Claire brought, capturing candid moments in the dim glow of the fairy lights Eliza had strung up. Around 11 p.m. Claire handed Eliza the camera. "Your turn to document the night," she said. Eliza laughed and began snapping pictures of her friends. As the photos developed, she laid them out on the coffee table. Everyone leaned in to admire them, but their playful chatter died when Claire picked one up and frowned. "What's this?" Claire asked, holding up the photo. The group looked. It showed Eliza posing with 3 of her friends, but behind them, in the corner of the room, stood a figure, a man. He was tall, gaunt, and pale, with deep-set eyes that seemed to stare directly into the lens. Eliza's stomach dropped. "Who is that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Maybe it's a reflection or something," one of her friends offered weakly, though the unease was clear on everyone's faces. Determined to prove it was nothing, Eliza turned and took another picture of the same corner. The photo developed slowly, the colors bleeding into shape. When it was fully formed, Eliza felt her blood run cold. The man was closer now, standing just behind the couch where Claire sat. Eliza dropped the picture, her breath quickening. "This isn't funny," she said, her voice trembling. Her friends looked around nervously, scanning the room, but no one saw anything unusual. The atmosphere shifted, the once lively room now heavy with tension. "Let's just forget it," Claire said, forcing a laugh. "Probably a glitch with the camera." But the unease lingered. One by one, the guests began to leave, muttering excuses about early mornings or long drives. By midnight, the apartment was empty except for Eliza and the stack of photos on the table. She flipped through them, heart racing as she noticed the man appeared in every picture, growing closer each time. The final photo showed him standing just behind her, his pale face inches from hers. A loud thud snapped her out of her trance. It came from the bedroom. Eliza froze. She hadn't been in there all night. Slowly, she stood and crept toward the door, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The door was ajar, the darkness inside seeming deeper than it should have been. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely a whisper. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Moonlight spilled in through the window, casting long shadows across the bed. The room was empty. She exhaled shakily, turning to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her. Eliza screamed, fumbling for the light switch, but the bulb only flickered weakly before going out. In the darkness, she heard it, slow, deliberate breathing. "Get out," she whispered, backing toward the window. The breathing stopped, replaced by a low, guttural laugh. "You invited me," a voice rasped. Eliza's eyes darted to the corner of the room. The man from the photos stood there, his gaunt face lit by the faint glow of the moon. He smiled, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. "You blew out the candles," he said, stepping closer. "You made a wish." Eliza pressed herself against the window, heart pounding. "I didn't wish for this," she cried. The man tilted his head, his hollow eyes glinting. "You wished not to be alone," he said, his voice a mocking echo of her own thoughts. "And now, you never will be." The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, stretching toward her as the man stepped closer. Eliza's screams were swallowed by the darkness, the window frosting over with a sudden chill. The next morning, Claire stopped by to check on her. The apartment was silent. The cake sat untouched on the counter, the Polaroid camera resting beside it. On the coffee table was a single photograph, Eliza, smiling, with the gaunt man standing right beside her. Maggie's 18th birthday was supposed to be a quiet affair. Her family wasn't big on celebrations, and most of her friends had gone out of town for the holidays. So, when her mom surprised her with a vintage-looking cake adorned with 18 thin, waxy candles, Maggie couldn't help but smile. "Where did you get this?" Maggie asked, running her fingers along the intricate, hand-piped decorations. The cake smelled faintly of vanilla and something else, something musky, like old wood. Her mom shrugged. "I found a little bakery off the main road. The woman there insisted this was the perfect cake for new beginnings." Maggie rolled her eyes but played along. She wasn't superstitious, after all. After dinner, her mom lit the candles and turned off the lights, bathing the room in a warm, flickering glow. "Make a wish," her mom said, clapping her hands. Maggie leaned forward, her breath stirring the flames. She hesitated, thinking about the usual wishes, happiness, good grades, love, but then decided to wish for something simple, a year full of surprises. She blew out the candles in one smooth breath, and for a moment, the room was pitch black. Then, the lights flickered back on. Her mom cheered, and they cut into the cake, the air filling with its rich, sweet aroma. The first bite tasted strange, though. Not bad, just off. Maggie couldn't put her finger on it, but she chalked it up to the cake being handmade. By the second bite, the odd taste had faded, replaced by an overwhelming drowsiness. That night, Maggie woke abruptly, heart pounding. She didn't know why at first. Then, she heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from the corner of her bedroom. Her eyes darted to the corner. Nothing. She told herself it was just her imagination and tried to go back to sleep. But as she turned over, she noticed something peculiar. The air smelled faintly of wax and smoke, like birthday candles that had just been snuffed out. Weird, she thought, pulling the blanket tighter around her. She eventually drifted off, her dreams filled with flickering lights and whispers she couldn't quite make out. The next morning, she noticed the first change. A candle, nearly identical to the ones from her birthday cake, sat on her desk. It wasn't there before. Its wick was burnt, and a thin trail of wax had dripped down its side. "Mom? Did you leave this in my room?" Maggie called out. Her mom frowned from the kitchen. "What are you talking about?" Shrugging, Maggie dismissed it as some kind of prank. But over the following days, more candles appeared, on her dresser, by the sink, even at her bedside. Each one was burnt as if used, and the scent of musky wax lingered no matter how many times she aired out her room. By the third night, she couldn't take it anymore. She gathered the candles in a box and dumped them outside in the trash. But that night, the scraping sound returned, louder this time. Maggie froze in bed, staring at her closet door, which had creaked open an inch. Her breath caught as she saw a faint flickering light from within. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The light disappeared, leaving her room in total silence. But just as she was about to turn on her lamp, a raspy voice whispered from the darkness. "You invited us." Maggie bolted upright, scrambling for the light switch. The room lit up, empty except for the faint smell of burnt wax and something else, decay. The next morning, she woke to find her reflection in the mirror wasn't quite hers. Her eyes were sunken, her skin pallid. A sense of dread crept over her. She skipped breakfast, desperate to shake off the feeling, and decided to visit the bakery her mom had mentioned. When she arrived, the building was derelict, its windows boarded up and its sign faded with age. Confused, she stepped closer, peering through a crack in the boards. Inside, dusty shelves stood empty, and a single, melted candle sat on the counter. A cold breeze swept past her, carrying the faint sound of whispers. Maggie stumbled back, her heart racing. When she returned home, her mother looked at her with wide, frightened eyes. "Maggie," she whispered, "what happened to you?" "What do you mean?" Maggie asked, her voice shaky. Her mom handed her a mirror. Maggie gasped. Her face was hollow, her skin now an ashen gray. And on her wrist, faint but unmistakable, was a burn mark in the shape of a melting candle. That night, Maggie lit every light in the house, refusing to sleep. But as midnight struck, all the lights went out. One by one, candles flared to life, surrounding her, their flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. And in those shadows, she saw them, figures twisted and burned, their faces frozen in agony. "Your wish," they whispered in unison, their voices overlapping, "was granted." As the flames grew brighter, the figures closed in, their waxy hands reaching for her. Maggie's screams were muffled by the suffocating heat of melting wax and smoke. The next morning, the house was empty. On the dining table sat a single, untouched cake, its candles burnt to stubs. On the plate next to it was a Polaroid of Maggie, smiling with a crowd of shadowy figures behind her. Her wish had come true, a year full of surprises, but none she could have ever imagined. For as long as she could remember, Ruby's birthdays had been unremarkable. She wasn't the kind of person people threw surprise parties for, and most years, the day passed with little more than a card from her parents and a cheap cake from the grocery store. But her 21st birthday was different. A box arrived at her apartment that morning, wrapped in deep crimson paper and tied with a gold ribbon. There was no return address, just a card that read, "For Ruby, because you're special. Opened after midnight." Ruby couldn't guess who might have sent it. She asked her friends and family, but no one claimed responsibility. Her roommate, Kara, teased her about having a secret admirer. "Midnight? That's so dramatic," Kara said, smirking. "Maybe it's a horror movie waiting to happen." Ruby laughed it off but felt an odd unease. The box was heavier than it looked, and the paper felt strangely warm to the touch. She tried not to think about it as the day wore on, but her eyes kept darting back to the gift sitting on her desk. At exactly 11:59 p.m., Ruby sat cross-legged on her bed, staring at the box. The apartment was quiet. Kara had gone out with friends, leaving Ruby alone. She hesitated, glancing at the clock as it ticked over to 12 o'clock. Taking a deep breath, she tugged the ribbon loose and peeled back the paper. Inside was a small, black wooden box with intricate carvings of what looked like snakes winding around its edges. There was no latch, just a hinged lid. Ruby lifted the lid slowly, her heart pounding. Inside was an antique hand mirror with a tarnished silver frame. Its glass was spotless, almost unnaturally so, as though it had been polished moments before. "That's underwhelming," she muttered, holding it up to inspect. But as she angled the mirror toward herself, her breath caught. The reflection wasn't hers. The woman staring back had Ruby's features, but her eyes were dark and sunken, her skin pale and waxy. Her lips curled into a sinister smile as Ruby recoiled, dropping the mirror onto the bed. "What the hell?" she whispered, her voice shaking. She picked the mirror up again, this time angling it to reflect the room. Everything appeared normal, her posters, her lamp, the open closet. But when she tilted it toward herself, the other version of her returned, leaning closer as if pressing against the glass. "Who are you?" Ruby stammered. The reflection tilted its head, and for a moment, it seemed to whisper something Ruby couldn't hear. Then, without warning, it raised a hand and pressed it against the inside of the glass. Ruby felt a cold pressure against her cheek. She screamed, dropping the mirror again, but this time it didn't land on the bed. Instead, it hit the floor and shattered. The pieces lay scattered, each shard reflecting her room from a slightly skewed angle. And in every shard, the distorted version of her still stared back, watching. Ruby scrambled to her feet, her breaths coming in panicked gasps. One by one, the reflections began to move independently, their movements no longer matching her own. They leaned closer, their mouths opening wider and wider until they seemed to be screaming silently. Then, the sound came. It was a high-pitched, piercing wail that filled the room, making Ruby cover her ears. The shards of glass trembled on the floor, and the air grew colder, heavy with the scent of something metallic and decayed. "Ruby," a voice whispered, low and guttural, echoing through the room. She spun around, but no one was there. Her reflection in the full-length mirror across the room stared back, wide-eyed and terrified. She looked down at the shards on the floor, each reflection was gone. The room fell silent. For a brief moment, Ruby thought it was over. But then the mirror on the wall cracked, a long, jagged line splitting her reflection in two. From the fissure, a dark hand reached out, long, bony fingers dripping with something black and viscous. Ruby froze, unable to move as the hand clawed at the edges of the mirror, pulling the rest of the figure through. It was her, but not her. The creature that stepped out had her face, her body, but its movements were jerky, wrong. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes were empty sockets. "Thank you," it rasped, its voice hollow and echoing. "I've waited so long." Ruby stumbled backward, but the creature moved quickly, closing the gap between them in an instant. It grabbed her wrists with an icy grip and leaned in, its breath freezing against her skin. Before she could scream, it whispered, "You're free now." The next morning, Kara returned home to find Ruby sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee. "Hey, birthday girl. You were up late," Kara said, tossing her keys onto the counter. "Everything okay?" Ruby looked up and smiled, but her eyes, once warm and brown, were now cold and empty. "Perfect," she said, her voice softer, calmer. "Everything is perfect." Kara noticed the shattered pieces of the mirror still scattered across Ruby's bedroom floor later that day, but she didn't ask about them. And she didn't notice the faint reflection in the shards, Ruby's real face, screaming silently, trapped behind the glass. Amara's 30th birthday was supposed to be a quiet evening. She wasn't in the mood for parties or surprises, just a cozy night at home with her favorite movie and the small cake she'd picked up on her way home from work. Life had been lonely lately, and she figured keeping things simple would hurt less. As she set the cake on her kitchen counter, something caught her eye. A single candle had been placed on top of the cake, even though she hadn't bought any. It was a thin, dark candle, with a faint shimmer that seemed to pulse when the light hit it. "Well, that's weird," she muttered. She was sure the cake hadn't been decorated like this when she bought it. But the baker might have thrown it on as a bonus, who knows. With a shrug, Amara lit the candle and turned off the lights to create a cozy mood. The flickering flame cast long shadows across her small apartment, giving the space an oddly eerie glow. "Happy birthday to me," she whispered with a chuckle and leaned down to blow out the candle. The moment she did, the room went pitch black. Not the kind of dark you get when you turn off the lights, this was suffocating, all-encompassing, like the air itself had been stolen from the space. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. A low, raspy whisper responded. "Make a wish." Amara froze. Her heart thudded against her chest. The voice was so close it felt as if someone were speaking directly into her ear. She fumbled for her phone to turn on the flashlight, but the moment she touched it, the screen shattered in her hand, as if something had swiped across it. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, this time more insistent. "Make a wish." Amara backed away until she hit the kitchen counter. The candle, though blown out, had started to glow faintly, its wick burning with an unnatural, dark blue flame. The flame twisted and stretched, forming shapes that danced like shadows of figures in the walls. Okay, Amara stammered, unsure of what else to do. I wish for this to stop. I wish for this to go away." The flame flared brightly, filling the room with a blinding light. Amara shielded her eyes, but when she looked back, the room was normal again. The lights were on, the cake sat innocently on the counter, and the strange candle was gone. For a moment, she thought it had all been a hallucination, stress from work, maybe. But as she approached the cake, she noticed something was off. The surface wasn't smooth anymore. Words had been etched into the frosting, letters jagged and uneven, "You wished wrong." Before she could react, the shadows on the walls moved. They peeled away from their surfaces and began to crawl toward her. Long, spindly arms reached out, and faces formed in the dark, mouths twisted into cruel, hungry grins. Amara grabbed a knife from the counter and swung wildly, but the shadows passed through it like smoke. They surrounded her, whispering in unison, their voices rising in an eerie chant, "Blow out the candle. Make a wish. Blow out the candle. Make a wish." Amara's screams were swallowed by the darkness. The next day, her apartment was quiet. Friends who stopped by to wish her a belated happy birthday found the place empty, though the cake still sat on the counter, untouched. And on top of it, a single, dark candle burned with a flame that would never go out. Love these stories? YouTube algorithm suggests that you would like to listen to these stories. Click on the video on the screen.